Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of the notes on cell biology. We have already summarized the endosymbiotic theory. We have discussed and done some practice with cell size and shape. Now we're going to look at the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. One of the most distinguishing characteristics between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell is the presence of those membrane-bound organelles. There is more that I'm going to expect you guys to know. So what I'm going to do is take up an entire square of our mega sheet. Remember, we folded our mega sheet in half and then in half again. And now I'm going to take up some space here to discuss or to compare and contrast the prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell. It doesn't matter which square you put it in, but we are going to place it in on one of these squares. So again, the first thing that we talk about is the presence of those membrane-bound organelles. You do have to specify membrane-bound organelles. So in eukaryotes, they're present. In prokaryotic, there are no membrane-bound organelles. This does not include ribosomes. Ribosomes are not membrane-bound. And the most important membrane-bound that distinguishes those eukaryotic cells is the presence of a nucleus, and that contains the genetic information. This is membrane-bound, very important, because in prokaryotes, there is no membrane-bound nucleus. Instead, you have the nucleolus. The nucleoid, getting ahead of myself. The nucleoid is not membrane bound. It's just an area within the prokaryote where you is likely to find that the DNA of the prokaryotic cell. So the nucleoid is not membrane bound. The nucleus is membrane bound. Eukaryotic cells tend to be larger than prokaryotic cells, which tend to be smaller. Eukaryotic cells have DNA that is linear. They'll usually have many. They'll have many chromosomes, and they will have histones. Histones are proteins that aid in DNA coiling. You're also going to find in eukaryotic cells, you're going to find introns. And we'll talk about those later in the year. For prokaryotic DNA, if we're doing side-by-side comparison, when we want to talk about that DNA, prokaryotic cells have circular DNA. They'll usually only have one. It's a single cell. Now, a single circular double-stranded helix. They do not have histones. In prokaryotic, they don't have those proteins that aid in coiling, so we say that the DNA is naked. And in most prokaryotic cells, and we're talking about the true prokaryotic cells, there will be no introns. And again, we'll talk about what those are later in the year. At this point, you just need to know that they don't have them. In eukaryotic cells, when they do division, you'll have mitosis and meiosis. In prokaryotes, they divide by binary fission. Eukaryotic cells, if there is a cell wall present, it's going to be either made of chitin or cellulose, and both of these are carbohydrates. In prokaryotes, if there is a cell wall, it's going to be made of a compound called peptidoglycan. Peptid for protein, glycan for carbohydrates. So it's a carbohydrate and protein blend. Your eukaryotes are going to be the animal kingdom, plants, fungi, protista. Your prokaryotes are only going to be bacterial cells. So, we've talked about, we're contrasting prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles. Eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles. And remember, this does not include the ribosomes. Prokaryotes have an area called the nucleoid where you're going to find its DNA. Eukaryotes have a nucleus where you will find its DNA. Prokaryotes are smaller than the eukaryotes. Prokaryotic DNA is circular. There's usually only one chromosome. It's naked, meaning that it doesn't have proteins called histones to help it coil up, and it doesn't contain neutrons. Eukaryotic DNA is linear. They'll usually have multiple chromosomes. They do have those histones, those proteins that act as a spool for the DNA, and you do find introns in eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells divide by mitosis or meiosis, whereas prokaryotes will divide by binary fission. If there is a cell wall present in those prokaryotes, it's going to be made of peptidoglycan. If there is a cell wall in eukaryotes, it's going to be made of chitin or cellulose. And then some examples include bacteria for the prokaryotes. That's the only example. And then eukaryotes are your animals, plants, fungi, and protista. So at the very bottom, I'm going to put here what they have in common. So between the prokaryotic and eukaryotic DNA, there are some similarities. Number one, you have your plasma membrane made of phospholipid, that phospholipid bilayer. They do contain ribosomes. They both contain ribosomes. They are slightly different in their structure, but their function is the same. They both use nucleic acids, specifically DNA, as their genetic material. And using the fact that all organisms, prokaryotic and eukaryotic organisms, use the same 4 nitrogenous base pairs in those nucleic acids can be used to justify a last universal common ancestor, or what we like to call LUCA. So these are your notes for prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cells. It took up an entire square on our mega sheet, and thanks for watching.